I don't think that the global economy deserves to be looked upon very optimistically. There's very little growth, if any at all, because the GDP figures that are published by governments are meaningless, and I explain why they're meaningless. Depending on the rate of inflation you are assuming or calculating statistically, you will get totally different results. So assuming someone says in the long run, the US economy grows at 3% per annum. Okay, but if the inflation is 2% higher than what the government is publishing, then there is not 3% growth, but maybe only 1%, or maybe in some sectors negative growth. The figures that the governments are publishing are all based on statistics that also the government is publishing. I personally think that one of the qualities or virtues of politicians is that the moment they become politicians, they're becoming liars. They lie about everything. So why would they lie about everything but not about statistics that they publish? Give me one good argument. So my view is, if we look at the global economy and we look at statistics that cannot be faked a lot or cannot be massaged a lot, but real statistics, say car sales and consumption of individuals in a shop, and the announcement by the corporate sector about the spending habits of people and so forth and so on. And you have to go out of your room and maybe observe a little bit instead of watching the telephone all the time. Maybe observe the traffic at the station or the traffic at airports or the traffic in duty-free shops. And then my view would be that since 2018, 2019, in real terms, the economy in the world has not grown, but actually still somewhat below the level of 2018, 2019. And if we consider growth as being an increase in the standard of living of the typical household in the world, then there has been no growth. The typical standard of living of individuals in the world has been going down, with maybe one exception, like India. But in general, the cost of living increases in the world of households has exceeded their salary gains or their earnings. CNBC and all these media outlets and the major newspapers, what they're publishing is what the government is telling them. And most of the articles and the media reports are completely wrong. They're not corresponding to the economic reality nor the political reality. And that is the first step I would undertake. And number two, I would say to myself, well, if there's no growth, the governments will continue to print money to make it look like growth, because, you can just essentially create fiscal deficits. In other words, the government has a deficit. They spend more than they get into the kitty every year. That is then financed by the central bank that issues money to purchase the bonds that the government is issuing. By essentially spending more than the government collects in tax, they can give to every household a certain amount of money, which they've done. And they can subsidize certain industries, which they've done as well. So let's say an individual, a private entrepreneur, he might not build a factory, but if the government comes and says, well, we'll give you $1 billion to build the factory, then the entrepreneur says, okay, I get $1 billion from the government, I build the factory, even though the factory may never be profitable. So the government can play all kinds of games and give a wrong impression about the true health of the economy. And what the individual should do with that statistic, he should be very careful about investing based on strong economic growth and economic recovery and so forth. And we've had some figures recently where we even had figures where the government admits that it overstated employment gains and so forth and so on. So equipped with that, the individual can decide, well, I buy more stocks on growth expectations, or I buy more bonds on recession expectations, or I avoid the dollar and so forth. I mean, each individual has to interpret the news himself. Exactly doing nothing should not be the job of an individual. You are typical people who believe the government should do everything for the households. The government should tell you to buy stocks or sell stocks and so forth and so on. This is not my view. My view is that you have the information. You know the government is lying, and then you take your responsibility and you act upon it. I think paper currencies will continue to depreciate in value, and the currencies which cannot be printed, such as precious metals, they will appreciate relative to the currencies that can be printed. But I've been saying that for the last 40 years. It's nothing new. And I'm not telling viewers to run out of the door now and go and pile in and put all their money in gold and silver. It all has to do it in a measured way. And the measured way is also to look at what is my personal wealth situation. I have a lot of gold and silver, but I'm fully aware that gold and silver doesn't give me any income. I have no income. I have no cash flow from holding gold and silver. So each individual has to decide how much does he want to have in gold and silver. I think that oil is inexpensive at this level. And I think that the world is underestimating the future demand for crude oil. So I would be rather long crude oil than short. Number two, we can observe the positions of participants in the commodity futures market. In the commodity futures market, we have large speculators and small speculators, and we have commercials. The commercials are people that are involved, say, in the oil trade, or they are oil producers. And the speculators are mostly, say, hedge funds. Now, the commercials, they are now very light on short positions in the oil market, which means the professionals, ones that are involved in daily oil transactions, like oil companies, they think the price is now relatively low. And I'm not a particularly smart guy, so I prefer to go along on the side of well-informed people. And the commercial traders are not usually better informed than, say, the public, the small speculators. In a money printing environment, the central banks print money. And I don't want to give a speech why central banks have only one option. Democracy is a failed system because the voters, they like that the government takes measures that actually lead to inflation. They don't like inflation, the so-called consumer price inflation, where food prices go up, gasoline prices go up, mortgage rates go up. That they don't like. But they like the inflation of assets. When, say, copper goes up, or when house prices go up, when the value of their books go up, or diamond prices go up, or their paintings which they bought last week at an auction, that they like that this goes up. But they don't like when the food prices go up, and when their budgets at home, when the housewives pay attention to how much they spend on food and on necessities of life. What is not a necessity, such as art and collectibles, stamps and badges and baseball cards and so forth. People love that to go up in value. Now, the money printing lifts assets, including commodities and gold and silver. But a weak economy is a headwind for the demand of commodities. So if China is in recession and doesn't recover, the demand side for copper is not going to be very good. So I want to explain. You have two head and tailwinds. They're coming against each other. And it's difficult to determine which will prevail. My view is that first, the demand side will disappoint the prices of commodity holders. That, the demand is disappointing and so forth. And I also like to mention, in the case of precious metals, an important point. When people are squeezed financially, they have to sell something. Usually they will not sell their homes because they live in their homes and it would lead to a loss of income and so forth. So that they'll keep. It's also a loss of face because the neighbors can see, oh, my neighbor has to sell his house, and they joke about him and the children joke about them and then. Usually they will also not sell their cars because there's lots of face. Again, compared to the neighbor, you have to sell your car. Neighbors will immediately say, or the local stores, what, this guy must be in trouble, he has to sell his car. And in poor countries, they will usually not sell their houses, their cars, and their motorcycles, because they need their motorcycles in poor countries to bring the children to school and take them back to home. So these are no-goes. But in poor country, a lot of people, in a country like Vietnam, every family has some gold. So in poor countries, when the price of commodities goes up and the economy goes down, they sell the gold. That's why, in my view, the gold should be higher at the present time based on money printing, but it's not, because there's a lot of sellers in the gold market. The fundamentals of uranium, with the American State Department in power, who wants a war everywhere in the world. Whenever they see a nail, they have to bring a big hammer and hit it down. So with that in mind, the demand for uranium will go up. Then we have the really dumbed down green communists in Germany and other countries. They talk about climate change, but themselves have no clue about what causes climate change. And we don't know precisely what causes it. But the point is this: all these clowns will be out of government in a little while, because like in Germany, this is now a really good example how a country is not destroyed by an enemy. The country destroys from within. They have decided to essentially commit economic suicide. That's why they have the German government consisting of Scholz, Baerbock, Habeck, and more, people who are completely incompetent but are interventionists. You understand? If you're incompetent and you don't do anything, you're actually a good economist because you don't interfere into the economy. But the worst is to be incompetent and take the wrong fiscal and other measures into the economic process. I think the stocks had a good move. They are now correcting, and there is the demand being stimulated. I mean, the commodities are driven up by money printing, but the demand side is maybe not as strong as the analysts project. Real estate in big financial centers is not particularly attractive. There are exceptions. Real estate in Asia is probably more attractive than in the United States and in Europe. But if you travel the world and you open your eyes instead of watching your mobile phone all the time, you may notice cities like Petra and Venice and Babylon and Nineveh and Rome and so forth, and that the cities that were important and today they are meaningless economically speaking and politically speaking in the world. Now, once you know that, you can deduce that maybe there are some cities that are financial centers today, like New York or London or whatnot, that are one day not going to be doing very well. I mean, you look at Manchester. Manchester was lucky. It was one of the richest cities in around 1830, 1840. And then the manufacturing centers shifted more to the US, first to the East Coast, then to the Midlands, in other words, the region around Chicago and the Great Lake districts, and later to California. So we have this rise and fall of cities and the shift in the centers of economic gravity in the world. Manchester was lucky to have two of the best soccer clubs in the world. It's no longer a manufacturing center. That I want to stress. And I'm not sure New York will have two successful soccer clubs. Maybe they have two baseball clubs. I don't know. But I'm just saying things will change and new centers of prosperity will come up. I think in small villages in Europe, real estate is cheap. And for the last 150 years, the Industrial Revolution meant that in year 1800, 80 to 90% of population in the world, they were employed in agriculture, and they didn't live in cities, but lived in the countryside. Then there was the flight to the cities, the urbanization process, where the world went from, say, 20% urban population, 80% rural population, to 80, 90, 95% urban population. Now, we may have a reversal that could be quite permanent for a long time.